What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through the hidden cost of not automating and why I believe this is the biggest leverage point that any business owner should be making use of, especially now with the rise of AI and so much data driven decisions that are going to need to be made into the future. Also, how we're going to be scaling this inside Killer Chaos OS, how we're refining the machine and actively building the machine in order to create as much value as we possibly can. So the main mission with these videos is ultimately to build a thinking OS, basically to enable us to refine the machine in terms of Killer Chaos OS, which is our own internal operating system in terms of how we are actively building backend systems. And if there's one thing that I've learned throughout this whole entire journey of building backend systems, it's this one thing, which is the cost of automating is far higher than the cost of building automation. And what this basically means is the cost that you're going to incur during your business's cycle of not automating and just being a brick and mortar business and just forcing things in sense of doing things manually on a day-to-day basis, the more you ultimately paying the price of not just paying the initial cost in order to automate. Because one of the main things that we are seeing in this day and age is ultimately the rise of AI. And with the rise of AI, why not make use of it in the sense of saying, hey, we need to automate the front facing layer, which are the things that we are doing on a day-to-day basis, that ultimately if we can remove ourselves from that, we are ultimately able to focus on the high leverage points that ultimately scale the business a lot further. Because one of the things that I have seen a lot is doing these repeatable steps on a day-to-day basis, whether it's manual entry of data and also just these processes that could be deleted in order to scale the business outside. And every time you are basically doing the same manual task, you're silently playing in time, attention, and opportunity cost. What this basically means is you're basically spending so much time doing manual tasks on a day-to-day basis, and that attention that you're spending on that task that you're doing on a day-to-day basis manually is ultimately costing you opportunities. And what I mean by opportunities, it could be in many different forms. Deal flow, for example. Say, hey, your team is actively focusing on refining the sales the sales processes that you have, in the sense that they're actively just manually inputting how many closes, how many win rates, and all these different things on a day-to-day basis. And you're also ultimately actively seeking to say, hey, did this deal close, did XYZ happen? And that creates a lot of confusion, and through that time that ultimately costs your business long term, because ultimately you could have better spent that time in building out the system that ultimately allows you to understand, hey, these are our sales flow, these are the sales flows that we have, and this is how we're actively automating these sales flows, so that when a deal does pop through, each and every person within the team understands that, hey, this information is logged, now I just have to look at it. And that ultimately allows you to have the time that ultimately allows you to scale your business, and which ultimately means you're closing more deals. And through this, it's like paying a subscription fee for inefficiency, because the worst subscription in the world is ultimately this fee for inefficiency. I think one of the most important things, especially now that we're heading into this new digital AI realm of space, is that we're ultimately the machines or the companies that are able to ultimately refine their machines and be the most efficient machines, or the ones that are going to scale. And these manual inputs and doing all these things on a day-to-day basis that ultimately takes your time and also your attention as well, is ultimately going to suck the opportunity cost that you could be creating. Because there's so many things that as a business owner you could be focusing on to create these opportunities that ultimately brings in more cash flow, but ultimately this comes from automating. And I think one of the biggest prices that you have to pay, and and especially in this digital age, is ultimately just automating. And this is why we've chosen the mode of building backend infrastructure and also the predictive analysis tool that we are actively building out, which is going to be a game changer in my opinion, in terms of how we're actively going to be able to spot the patterns and ultimately stop chaos in its tracks. And one of the things that funny enough that happened today is that I realized that for Chaos Killer OS, it's one of those things that are like super hard to explain. I had a presentation today, hence for the attire, and one of the things that I took away from that was that basically understanding on, conveying and breaking down what the vision of Killer Chaos OS is and what it actually does, to people that aren't necessarily in the space, is actually a new level of problem that I, did not take into account, or I, should have prioritize a lot more. And through this, this is just an inefficient process to say, hey, I'm actively learning, the price of automating, is ultimately a lot higher in the long term if you don't pay that initial subscription fee, which is one of the things that, we were speaking about. And one of the things that, happened today was, the discussion around, why is this specific process needed? Why do we need to ultimately, remove the business owner from the specific stage when they could go directly? And then one of the things that, I mentioned was ultimately saying, hey, in as much as, we're living in this digital, economy and things like that, ultimately, the business owner, from his perspective, it creates value from their side because they're able to create more opportunities for other people, and on their side they're able to, remove themselves in a sense that ultimately allows them, to scale the level of impact that they're having on their business. And also, this is ultimately just going to save them time because it does one of three things, which is, saves them mental bandwidth, which ultimately frees their brain for high value thinking. And I think this is one of the most important things, that if you're able to, free that mental bandwidth, because on a day-to-day, if you're not automating or you're not doing, the simple tasks that can be done through automation, you're basically spending that mental bandwidth that you could be spending on high leverage thinking. And on a day-to-day basis, I always ask myself that, hey, can I actively, find means or processes and, systems that I can actively build in this specific workflow that ultimately allows me to then scale my level of impact, basically building it once and then, just refining it as we go. Because ultimately, that high leverage thinking that you have in those moments when your mental bandwidth is free, ultimately is what is going to be the needle mover. At least in my opinion, I've seen it, so many times externally to say, hey, this person, free themselves, and this ultimately allowed them to, pick up a simple book, and through picking up that simple book, that ultimately allowed them to then, gain this nugget that ultimately changed the trajectory of their business. And also saying consistency, because consistency is one of those things. By removing human error from processes, we all make, human errors from day-to-day manual inputs as well, saying, hey, each and every single day, if you're adding data, you could, cause an error that ultimately affects the process. But how do you actively do this if you have one streamlined process and you have AI just run for 24 hours 365, or not even just AI, just simply just automating that process and removing yourself and, freeing that mental bandwidth that ultimately allows you to focus on high leverage thinking. And through this, it also, one of the main things, from the discussions as well that we had today, was scalability. Because you, in as much as you can recommend 1 to 2 people, to a company as well, to say, hey, this person's good enough for the job, that vetting process, that also that, recruitment refinement process takes a lot of time, and that process needs to be super dialed. Because if they come with 100 people and that one person's referring them, that talent pool needs to be refined and it needs to be processed in a manner that ultimately connects or matches the right partner within the infrastructure that ultimately allows them to find the right opportunities. And through that, you ultimately are able to then handle 10x the scale, 10x the volume, without burning out. Because in as much as you can do, all these day-to-day functions, the most important thing is not burning out. And through this, removing and automating is the mode that ultimately builds the vision or the future for what it is that we're actively building. Because I am such a big believer nowadays that, hey, you need to ultimately, or you can actively just remove yourself from the process of many simple things that you do on a day-to-day, and saying, hey, when I'm building Killer Chaos OS, I realized that automation wasn't optimal. It was the glue that made the system actually work under pressure. Because if you're actively implementing on a day-to-day basis, just your manual inputs on a day-to-day basis on things that could be automated, that's spending time that could be spent elsewhere in order, or in areas where you could actively just scale the level of impact that the business has. And I think now with the rise of AI and all these automation tools, now more than ever, it's made it more accessible to scale the level of impact that you do have into the future. Now it just then becomes a question of how do you pay that initial price now so that you don't have to pay it later. And through automation, you ultimately just pay that price and you don't pay that subscription fee of inefficiency, because long term that is going to destroy your business. And ultimately, the best of the best that I've seen externally looking outwards, they've ultimately just had this streamlined and dialed in process that has allowed them to scale their operations and just constantly refining it, because they paid that that initial build fee that they had to pay, so that they didn't have to pay that subscription fee for inefficiency. And long term that ultimately sucks. And saying, hey, without it, even the best processes is just a to-do list that eventually collapses. Because with time, you can do these manual inputs only so much, but after a extended period of time, you only can do so much, and you need to be able to scale that with consistency. And then through that, you ultimately create this mental bandwidth. But that means that leverage doesn't come from doing more, it comes from removing the need to do it all. One of the best builders, and I think I've been thinking about this since yesterday, one of the best of the best builders are actively these leverage machines. They actively are able to carve out so much leverage that you may see that, hey, they're working extremely hard, and of course they are doing. But one of the modes that I see looking outwards is that they've been able to carve this level of leverage that ultimately allows them to scale their impact. And that's why their impact feels so great, because they're just leverage architects. And through this, them being leverage architects, they're able to then build this grand vision of what it is that they're actively striving for, which ultimately makes me ask the question of how can we actively also just build these leverage machines and become leverage architects ourselves, because ultimately into the future that is ultimately going to create the value for our clients that they deserve as well. And I think the price of not automating long term, especially now with the rise of AI and the rise of all these different tools as well, and as well, is ultimately going to be far greater if you don't do it in the long term. And I think the best of the best businesses that are going to scale into the future are just going to higher and higher the barrier to entry, meaning that the ones that are doing these brick and mortar processes, they're not going to last long, because sure, that may have survived 5-10 years ago, but ultimately if you truly want to scale, especially with this new age, you ultimately just need to have these processes super dialed. And I want to be part of that future that ultimately builds this. I know we're going to get so many things wrong, like I always say, and we're going to just keep pushing the needle forward each and every single day. We're never going to stop. And the ultimate vision being redefining industries, also inspiring millions of people, and also just being able to drive the level of impact that we're going to be having into the future. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and I will see you guys in the next video.